Hello, everyone. Good evening or afternoon or whatever time it is where you're tuning in from. And welcome to the third session of Creation Justice Ministries Summer Reads on Life, Death, and Resurrection. If you don't already know, you're about to find out that this evening we're having a conversation with Brian McLaren about his new book, Life After Doom. My name is Avery Davis Lamb, and I have the pleasure of serving as the co-executive director of Creation Justice Ministries. The mission of Creation Justice Ministries is to educate, equip, and mobilize Christians and Christian institutions to protect, restore, and rightly share God's good creation. Before we get into the program tonight, I just want to share a few housekeeping things to note for you all. The first is please introduce yourself in the chat if you have not yet. And when you do so, be sure to select everyone so that everyone gets your introduction. We're going to have plenty of time for a Q&A at the end of the conversation. But what I need you all to do is to put your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There's a lot of people on today, so please don't put them in the chat because you risk getting lost in there and I can't keep track of that. So please use the Q&A function as you are able. Also, you'll notice this workshop is being recorded. So we'll send out the recording to all of the registrants, and it'll also be available on Creation Justice Ministries YouTube channel. The agenda for tonight is we're going to start by hearing a bit from Brian, just hearing a little bit to get us started. And then Brian and I will enter into a dialogue with each other about life after doom. And then we'll invite you all into the conversation through the questions that you send over to us. All in all, we'll get you out of here around 15 past the hour. Okay. So over the course of this summer, where have we been and where are we headed tonight with Brian McLaren? Well, this summer, like I said, we've been engaging through our summer read series with the question of what birth, death, and resurrection mean for us in a climate-changed world. For those of us who are Christian, how are these themes of our Christian faith more pronounced, made more sharp in an age that is becoming defined by climate change? In our first session, we engaged with Elizabeth Rush, who's author of The Quickening, who brought us along with her journey to the Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica and her similarly treacherous journey of deciding whether and how to parent in our climate-changed world. Our second session, we talked with Mallory McDuff, author of Our Last Best Act, and with our special guest, Ellen Davis of Duke Divinity School, around the questions of how do we die well? Specifically, how do we see death as an opportunity to love and to protect the people and places we love? If you missed those sessions, they're available as recordings on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Creation Justice Ministries. And tonight, we're in a conversation with Brian McLaren, author of Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. I just finished Brian's book last night, but even if you haven't read it yet, you can tell from the title that it's really different from books in this vein that have come before. Notably missing from the title are words hope, the words save, the word planet, or even the word climate change. But instead we get wisdom, courage, and yes, doom. And while many books situate us in a climate-changed world, Brian instead invites us to consider what might come after doom. Before I say too much and spoil the conversation for later, I want to transition over and introduce Brian McLaren. Brian McLaren is an author, speaker, activist, and public theologian. A former college English teacher and pastor, he's a passionate advocate for a new kind of Christianity. Christianity that's just, generous, and that works with people of all faiths for the common good. Brian is Dean of Faculty for the Center for Action and Contemplation. He's a podcaster with Learning How to See. He's the co-host of a conference called Southern Lights. And his newest book, out of approximately a million books, are Faith After Doubt, Do I Stay Christian, and tonight's topic, Life After Doom. His co-authored children's book, Cory and the Seventh Story, was released just last year. And very excitingly, the first book in a new science fiction trilogy of his
Mhm.
called The Last Voyage is going to be published in the summer of 2025. I've had the pleasure of spending just a little bit of time with Brian, not a lot, but just a little bit at the Wild Goose Festival. And just in those few interactions, I can attest that Brian is as kind and compassionate and generous as he seems in his writing. Brian, it's truly, truly a gift to spend this evening with you, and I'll pass it over to you to get us started.
Well, thanks so much, Avery. And good evening, everyone. I'm so honored that you took this time to be together. I grew up in a conservative evangelical family, and one of the very best things about my family was that my dad loved the outdoors. If it was a Saturday and we were going to eat, and the weather was anything close to uh, uh, appropriate, we would go out to some nearby park and set up on a picnic table. And if the weekend was going to be good and we could get away, we'd go camping. And when I became a little bit older, he made sure I went to summer camp where I got to enjoy the outdoors from morning to night for 2 weeks. And that really had an effect on me. Um, I never planned to be a pastor. My plan was to be a college English teacher because I loved literature. And while I was in graduate school, my wife and I started a little dinner group that became a house church. And eventually I left teaching and became the pastor of that community. And I served there for 24 years, and it's still going on and doing beautiful things in the Washington, D.C. area called Cedar Ridge Community Church. One Sunday in the late 1990s, I had preached a sermon about our environmental responsibility. Uh, and at the end of the sermon, a woman came up, and by that time, the church was large enough that, there were a lot of people who'd come there for a long time, but I hadn't met yet. She introduced herself and she said, that was really great. I've never really heard a sermon like that before. She said, but I noticed you didn't mention global warming. And for some of you, this might be hard to believe, but whenever this was, somewhere in 1998, 1999, I had never heard the term before. At least it had never registered. I remember saying to her, global warming, you mean nuclear winter, right? I'd heard that term before. And she said, no, you don't know about global warming. She said, all I'll tell you is you should go do some research on that term, look it up. And of course, the internet back then wasn't what it is now. Some of you remember that creepy sound that would come through your phone line when you were trying to log on. And I went home and looked up that term. And before long, I came onto this graphic of the ice caps of the Earth, and they went back to, I don't know if it was the 1950s, and they just showed, how every year in September, really right about now, the polar ice caps reach their minimum, and then they expand, and then they contract. And this was sort of on a fast motion loop through year by year. And you just watch it expand and contract. But each contraction was smaller and smaller and smaller. And I just remember that day, something changed in me. I said, okay, I knew that our environmental problems were serious, but even though at that point I hadn't studied the cryosphere, the importance of the ice caps and their role in regulating the climate of the Earth, I just knew this is going to change my life. From today forward, I see myself living in a different world. Um, And so some years later, I wrote a book called Everything Must Change, 2006, 2007. I wrote that book. And it was my attempt to try to understand global crises. And some of you may have read that book. And obviously, the environmental crisis was really, at, at the center of that whole situation. Um, and about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I've kept up. Like a lot of you, I've tried to keep up with the science, both our breakthroughs in technology, but also our breakthroughs in understanding the seriousness of our problems. Probably since 2006, 2007, well, so much has changed. The Paris Agreement happened. Our understanding of tipping points. I mean, just the scientific research that has happened has just multiplied. And so I started meeting more and more people who felt as I did that whenever people talk about we're going to fix this, we're going to solve this, that felt less and less believable to me. I started to feel that we were less in a situation of being in a game that we might win and more in a situation of being in a game that we were going to, and the question was, how humiliating would the loss be? How catastrophic would the loss be? In other words, I started to realize that things that I love in this world were already under such a threat that they were being lost. Later, I came upon an idea in psychology called baseline syndrome, that each child is born at a time where what's normal gets set for that child. And then through the person's life, the baseline might get worse and worse. But new children being born, for them, it goes back to being normal, right? And I started to consider how much has already been lost and 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 how much trouble is baked into our situation. And I started, both for myself and being introduced to many other people who were, and this word doom was rising in people's consciousness. And so when I wrote this book, I didn't use the word doom to mean the end of the world. All hope is gone. We might as well give up. That's not what I meant at all. By doom, I meant a psychological experience that many of us have had, a psychological experience where we realize are bigger. Our problems are bigger than our capacities to solve them. We might have conceptual solutions, but we might not have the political capacity to implement those solutions. Um, and so when I wrote this book, I wanted to try to face the worst of our news and say, if we don't minimize the situation, how are we going to live? And of course, for me as a committed Christian, um, no longer really identifying as evangelical, but still drawing much from my upbringing and so on. But for me as a Christian, what resources does my faith bring to me to help me have my eyes wide open to our current situation? I'll just say two other things and then turn it back to our conversation with Avery. First, one of the things I tried to do in the book is just sketch out 4 scenarios of what our future could be. Um, and those scenarios uh, go as follows. First is collapse avoidance, that we could get our global act together as a global civilization, and we could stop doing enough of the things that are harmful and start doing enough of the things that are needful to avert a collapse of civilization, of our global civilization. And you all understand, for the first time in history, in recent decades, we've really created this global civilization. It's all so interconnected. And that complexity and interconnectedness gives it resilience and fragility. There's a kind of combination of both. And, and so collapse avoidance says, we could get our act together and and avoid the worst of what we've already baked into the situation through our environmental behavior, our environmentally destructive behavior. Second is collapse rebirth, that no, we will not get our act together in time. And there will be some degree of civilizational collapse, meaning we will go down a few stairs or a few flights of stairs from our peak complexity. Um, and but after that, some amount of pain, we'll learn the lessons we should learn. And what we will rebuild will be more of an ecological civilization. Collapse avoidance, collapse rebirth. Third is collapse survival. We will not get our act together in time. There will be civilizational collapse to some degree, and we will survive. But what we think of as civilization, at least our civilization, will not survive. And that will mean a very different future. And then fourth, of course, is collapse extinction. And that's where we push the environmental limits to such a degree that, yeah, the world is just too hot and too changed. And if that happens, it won't just be humans, but it'll be many, many species and many, many ecosystems in the world that will be lost. And so in the book, I tried to create those four scenarios. And one of the things I said in the book is that I don't know which scenario will happen. I think what I noticed in my brain is that my brain wanted to either go to the first scenario, collapse avoidance, everything will be fine. We'll get through this. We'll get through this. Or if my brain wasn't satisfied there, I would go to the opposite, collapse extinction. It's no, there's nothing. We're not going to make it. And I'm suspicious of that. I know enough about human psychology that I think there are reasons that there are biases and glitches in my own brain, and I think in a lot of people's brains, that make me flip between these extremes. And so the last thing I'd like to say, the sentence that I wish I would have put in the book is this: I don't know what the future holds. I don't know. I'm pretty sure it's one of those four scenarios, and it may move from one to another. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know how I want to show up. And that's the thing that I think, that's the place where I think a deep and alive Christian faith helps us cope with. It helps us, and it helps us discover. It helps us kind of center down to a place where we become convinced of how we want to show up, whatever scenario unfolds. And yeah, that's what I hope will happen uh, for you if you read the book or if you have read the book. And even if you don't read it, I hope this conversation will be useful to you. So let me bring Avery back, and we can enter some conversation about this.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Brian, and thanks for that. Just that little taste of what you're exploring in Life After Doom. Yeah, I have a few questions here for you. The first one is a phrase that you use frequently in the book, especially in the beginning when you're sort of
Mhm.
doing the scene setting, and that's the phrase "welcome to reality."
Yes.
So, why is it important to say that? Why is it important for you to say that so frequently early on? And also, kind of implied in that is that we're kind of ignoring reality in
Mm.
some ways.
Yes. Yes, Avery. Uh, I mentioned the word bias before, and if anybody's interested, on my website, I have a little ebook I put together about this because I was talking about it a lot, and people said, "Could you give us something in writing?" And I think we have these glitches that are part of our brain functioning. You might say our brains are designed to keep us alive and to help us survive, but they're not perfectly designed to help us seize the truth. And there are a lot of things in our brains that help us avoid truths that are inconvenient. And and the and to actually break through those biases, those psychological barriers, things like confirmation bias, that we don't like to accept any new idea that messes up the furniture of our pre-existing ideas, or community bias. We don't like to accept an idea that will get us in trouble with our community. Um, these biases go very, very deep. And it takes a lot for us to break through and even sincerely be able to say, I want to know the truth no matter what it is. In that light, when you think of Jesus' famous saying, you shall know the truth and the truth shall make you free. Uh, well, what says that in a conversation with some people who have a whole lot of biases, beliefs, dogma that they they aren't willing to question. And we're all that way. So I think there's a part of this process of climate change that forces us to face things that aren't just deeply held beliefs, they're pre-critical assumptions that have shaped the way we think. Assumptions of capitalism, assumptions from the way we're taught history, assumptions from our whole literary framing, where we always assume there's a hero who will come in at the last minute. I even think we have theological assumptions here that that could make it less likely for us to survive
Mm.
because these assumptions tell us God would never let that happen, or God has the future planned and it's all going to work out fine. Uh, and many of these assumptions feel very pious, but I think there is another way to look at them that is closer to the truth. And so what I feel in the midst of that is I have to give myself a break and say, look, reality is not that easy to access. And so I'm welcoming myself into reality and I'm welcoming reality into myself. And it's a process. And there are times where I think all of us just have to put reality on the shelf. We're not ready for that yet.
Mm.
Um, but when we're ready, I think some number of us have to get as ready as we possibly can,
Mm.
if especially if we feel responsible to help others. So that's why that
Yeah.
chapter starts off the book.
Yeah. Well, and I want to pick up there too, because I'm sure a lot of people on this call are it frequently in conversations about climate change or
Yeah.
are, doing climate education or leaders at our churches.
Yes.
Um, and so there's a responsibility that we have that's not only us facing reality ourselves, but how are we bringing others along in this, right? And I think a lot of us have seen social science research and studies that show or have found that people can just shut down when they're
Yes.
faced with the true depth of the reality of what's going on.
Yes.
Um, but also there's some disservice that we do to people when
Yes.
we're not bringing them along and trusting that they can hold the doom, right? Hold the
Yes.
full reality. So, I mean, as someone who is engaging with others in this, like, how do you square those two?
Yes. Well, um, I one of my mentors when I was a pastor used to say to me, we must teach what Jesus taught in the manner that Jesus taught it. And
Mm,
he felt that we do Jesus and ourselves a disservice if we only look at what he taught and not how he taught it.
mm,
So Jesus often spoke in parables. And I think a parable is a way to gently bring people to a truth that if you were to just say it in plain prose, it might freak them out or it might make them so mad they'd walk away. And a parable has a way of easing into your consciousness little by little. And so I think we have to be careful to not push people too hard, too fast, so that they just shut down. But at the same time, if we just stop at the point when they shut down, I don't think we're doing them a service either. So I think we have to find ways to give them what they're ready for. And then if they let that sit with them, if they welcome that amount of reality, they'll be able to open themselves up to a little bit more reality. Um,
yeah.
uh, you mentioned I work with the Center for Action and Contemplation, and Richard Rohr often defines contemplation as meeting all the reality we can currently bear.
Mm,
And I
mm,
think that sense that this is a process for all of us.
yeah.
Uh, I think that's
Well,
part of our
yeah.
job. And I don't think there's an easy way through it. I think we're going to make some people mad.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's probably a sign we're doing
Yeah,
something right.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I love that. Teach what Jesus taught in the manner that he taught it. Kind of parables as a kind of spiritual technology.
yes,
that we can use. I mean, I think of sort of rituals fall into this category too,
Yes, yes.
right? Rituals as a way for us to bear more of the reality than we may be able to typically bear on our own.
You know,
Um,
if I could just throw out one
yeah.
thought in this quick anecdote, I had a flight get canceled once several years ago, and I was waiting in line. I had to wait in a line to get rebooked, and there were like 30 people in the line, and I got up to being number two in the line, and some guy walks right up to the front of the line and butts in front of the guy in front of me. And I'm thinking, oh boy, this is going to get tense. And the guy in front of me taps this fellow on the shoulder. He turns around and here's what he said. I hate it when people do what you just did. Now, and what was so fascinating to me is it didn't change anything, but he spoke a non-directive statement. He didn't call him a name, didn't insult him, didn't push him out of line, didn't tell him to leave. He just registered his reaction. And I call that the power of a non-directive statement.
Mm,
And so instead of telling someone, I really think you're blind, you're not paying attention to how serious this problem is, if we just say, someone says, "How are you?" and you say, "I'm doing okay, but man, I wake up every day. I see we need a new human-Earth relationship. We humans need a new relationship to the Earth." We didn't tell them anything. We just made our own testimony. We testified to what's true to us. For us, it's a non-directive statement that can be a little thought worm for them, and they're going to wonder, what did he mean by that? And that's, to me,
yeah.
that's following Jesus' example. Sometimes the best thing you do is you drop something that stimulates curiosity.
Hmm. Well, and it's creative ways to connect with other people about climate change as well.
Yes,
Right. I mean, you quote at some point you quoted Catherine Hayhoe
yes,
of, saying the best thing you can do about climate change is break the climate silence
yes,
and talk with each other about it. Back in I think November of 2022, Pew Research came out with this study that looked at religious attitudes towards climate change and found that less than 20% of mainline Christians are talking with each other about climate change, are ever talking with each other about climate
yeah,
change at church.
yes.
And I think it's because we're not practiced with the musculature that it takes to bring up climate change casually in conversation like that,
Yes.
right?
That's that's right.
Yeah. And so it feels like such a big topic, it feels so doom filled, right? That it's scary to bring it up. But what I'm hearing you say is that that's really contrary to what we need to do. We need to have these ways to personalize it, to connect with people around it.
If people want to drop something that would get people talking or thinking at church this Sunday, someone says, "How are you?" and you say, "You really want the truth?" "Yeah, how are you?" "I'm really, really worried." "What are you
Mm,
worried about?" According to recent research, well over 50% of mainline Protestants will vote for the presidential candidate and party who has the most harmful environmental policies, especially relating to climate change. So you could just drop something like that, and that's going to get people thinking and getting them talking. And I often think it helps people if we just say, listen, I'm not looking for an argument. You asked me how I'm doing. I just want to tell you,
yeah,
that's
this
how
is on
that's
my
how I'm
heart.
doing. This is on my
Yeah,
heart. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Ryan, let's talk about hope a little
Yes.
bit. Hope is complicated, right?
Yes.
That's the title of one of your chapters. And honestly, it's really a relief for me to read a book about climate that doesn't end with, but here's where I'm finding hope,
Yes.
right? That's such
Yes.
a space that we feel needs filled. And often when I'm doing presentations, the last question I'll get is, but where are you finding hope? And I find it a really hard question to answer. Um, so for you, what is your relationship with hope
Yes.
days? And in particular, how did you wrestle with that while you were writing this book?
Yes. Yes. Well, the first thing I'd say is if folks don't want to read the book and they just want to read one chapter, that wouldn't be a bad chapter. It's chapter 6 for
Mhm.
them to read. Um, uh, I think I can sum it up in this by the problem by saying this. Uh, well, I'll just remind people of a very pivotal moment when Greta Thunberg was speaking to a large group. She said this quite often, but uh, she was speaking to a large group, and someone said, "You young people give us such hope."
Hmm.
And she
Yeah.
thundered back, "I don't want your hope. I want you to panic because the house is on fire." Um, a- and uh, and I mean, people could quarrel with her saying that because panic is not often the best response either. But her point, I think, is right.
Hmm.
She realized that when people said, "You give us hope," what she interpreted hope to mean in that sentence is, I was getting anxious. Now I can return to my comfort zone. You young people will take care of
We've
me.
got it under control. Yeah.
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 And what that there's a certain kind of hope that is problematic in that way. What it means is permission to return to my previously scheduled complacency, right? But there are, and in the sort of serious climate world, there are a whole lot of people who have become anti-hope, and not just in climate, in a lot of social justice issues. And they have very legitimate arguments. Some, and I share them as clearly as I can in that chapter, that hope becomes permission for complacency for way too many people. Um, and but here's the flip side. I have a good friend, Daniel Gutierrez, who's a former student of mine who is a clinical psychologist. He spent his whole career studying the psychological benefits of hope.
Mm.
And among psychologists, there's very sophisticated ways of what they mean when they say the word hope. And listen, if you want to give a person a good future, one of the best things you can do is help them have those psychological characteristics. So
Mm.
there are people critiquing hope, and there are people talking about the essential dimension of hope. Um, and so I think it forces us to go deeper. If you want a definition of hope, here's what I would say. I would quote Václav Havel. Václav Havel said, "Hope is not the certainty that things will turn out as we wish. Hope is the conviction that some things are worth doing, no matter how they turn out." And that to me captures it. That's when I said earlier, I don't know what the future holds, but I know how I want to show up. I want to show up doing the things that are worth doing, no matter how they turn out.
Mm.
And um, and so loving this precious earth and wanting to save all of it that we can save, I
Mm.
want to show up that way. If you told me that a nuclear bomb was going to go off and it's all going to blow to bits in 3 weeks, for the next 3 weeks, I want to love
Mm.
every person, and I
Mm.
want to love every tree, and I want to love every precious thing, right? So there are things that are worth doing no matter how they turn out. I
Mm.
personally think it would be smart for as many of us as possible to get to that place, because that will put us in us a resolve that can keep going, even if there are horrible, horrible setbacks. Because the dimension of change that we need, you can guarantee we'll make 3 steps forward and 5 steps backward, and then maybe 6 steps forward and 2 steps backward. It's not going to be an easy process. We're going to need a kind of moral strength. Now, that I think is what the Bible means by hope, this deep virtue of hope. It's this moral strength. Here's one way, here could be one definition. It's a moral strength to have a will to do what's right, and even if you don't know the way to get there. It's a will without a way.
Yeah.
I think that will to live, that will to persevere, that will to do the right thing is a big part of what the best meaning that we have for hope.
Yeah. Yeah. Y- You're talking about the love of creation and connection with creation. We've talked about contemplation as well. And I feel like much of this work that you're talking about, yes, work of cultivating hope, but really the work that is set before us in this climate change time is about drawing closer to creation, about entering
Yes.
into contemplation of the goodness, contemplation of the divine who we encounter in creation, so that we can see clearly,
Yeah.
we can fall in love with creation,
Yeah.
right? And I think this inner work is so easy for us as activists to forget about,
Mhm.
right? It's not always easy. It's not mechanistic, right, to see the
Yeah.
connection between action and contemplation. So can you draw out that connection for us a
Yes.
little bit? And especially why that particularly matters in this climate change time.
Yes. Well, the first thing that comes to my mind, Avery, is a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer. I should memorize it. It's from her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And she's grieving how much we've wounded the earth. But she says, even the wounded earth gives us joy.
Mhm.
And 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 if we were to stop appreciating the joy that the wounded earth is giving us,
Mhm.
what a waste. That's another way of insulting the earth. And so she says the wounded earth is giving us joy, and that joy then gives us more motivation to keep caring for and saving this wounded earth.
I have a quote here, Brian.
Oh,
Actually,
beautiful. Thank
I
you.
earmarked it because so let me read it here.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's even a wounded world is feeding us. Even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy.
Uh,
I choose joy over despair, not because I have my head in the sand, but because joy is what the earth gives me daily, and I must return the gift.
uh, isn't that, thank you.
Yeah,
She says it so
yeah. I
perfectly.
mean, that's it. Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and, and it brings me back to a quote that, you know, as a writer, I know some of my very best things I've ever written could also be taken in a way different than intended. But
Hmm.
this is a quote from the great Catholic theologian Thomas Berry. I think this quote is getting close to 50 years old. It's at least 40 years old. He said he could summarize our current situation in three sentences. First, the glory of the human is the desolation of the earth. Oh my gosh, what a statement. Second, the desolation of the earth is becoming the future of the human. And the third,
Hmm.
every human activity must be judged by its contribution to a new mutually enhancing earth human relationship. And that phrase, mutually enhancing human earth relationship, to me is one of the things that if I believe that, and I do, that just rings so true to me. We aren't going to solve the problem with a new technology if we maintain the same utilitarian attitude toward the earth.
Right.
This is to me why the climate change situation, as the wonderful, brilliant John Dorhauer, I'm sorry, Jim Antal, a colleague of John Dorhauer,
Mhm.
Jim Antal said in his book, uh, Climate World, Climate Church, or Climate Church, Climate World.
Yeah,
Jim Antal's great book. Um, he uh, uh, this is an opportunity that, like, the world has never needed a spiritual lesson as much as it needs right now as a matter of survival. We need to develop a new spiritual relationship with the earth. And and
yeah,
so suddenly I realized when I went out today and took a walk and noticed the changing of the seasons and savored, I saw a little common musk turtle scrambling down a creek that I'd never seen in that creek before. And noticing and appreciating and letting the earth give me that joy and paying the earth my attention, the love in the form of attention, that's part of forging a new human earth relationship in this little human body. And as more and more of us do that, I think that's part of shifting the center of gravity in a direction it needs to go.
yeah, yeah. One of the kind of most compelling and also maybe most gut-wrenching pieces of your book for me was just your comments on how we could get so obsessed with collapse avoidance at any cost
Yeah,
that we kind of re-inscribe or we reinforce the our disconnection from creation, kind of these technocratic solutions that are actually
yeah,
causing the problem. And you write here that quote, fixing today's crisis in a superficial way could kick the time bomb down the road to create
Mm,
an even greater ultimate catastrophe.
yeah. Yeah, as you'll recall, when I wrote that, I think I said something like, I hate writing these words, you
Yeah,
know, I
yeah,
hate saying this, but I think, you know, I think we're in a situation with the earth the way uh, I was some years ago when a doctor diagnosed me with melanoma. And, he basically, after the surgery, he said, look, if you had not found this now, if you'd waited 6 months, I'm not sure you would have a future. So there are times where you need the doctor to tell you, here's how bad things are. Don't minimize it. Don't put it off. Don't, you know, let's face the worst of the diagnosis now. And if we face the diagnosis deeply enough, it's going to make us realize how deep the change needs to be.
yeah.
And um, and the beautiful thing about this is something else that when the next edition of the book comes out and I can write it afterward, I want to try to say something about is the writing this book and now being out speaking about it for these months has helped me see that human we the technical term we use for it is neuroplasticity. We humans have enormous capacity to be different, and it's not only true of individuals, it's true of societies. um, and we could become different in beautiful ways, and 200, 300 years from now people could be living in a way with the earth and with each other, because really the roots of the environmental crisis and the roots of our social justice crises, from wealth inequality to white supremacy, colonialism, racism, to gender inequality, to prejudice in all of its different forms, all of these crises have to do with the same sort of nugget at the root, the same core. And oh my goodness, we could be in so much of a better place. This is like this gift to help us face this deepest issue of realizing that we thought that we lived on the earth as if we were something else. The book of Genesis, it's so interesting. Adam means red clay. So
Mhm.
our very name that we're given in the first chapter of the Bible is children of soil, children of the red earth. And we could rediscover ourselves, not as living on the earth. We are part of the earth. We're part of the earth community. And my suspicion, if we go on the journey we need to go on, is that we'll hear a phrase like kingdom of God, and that will no longer seem to us like some faraway place or even something in the far distant future. It will help us see, no, that's being part of the ecosystem, the sacred ecosystem of the whole earth. And
Mm.
gosh, we're in a place now to appreciate that. And even and I can give testimony here. If to the degree I see and live that now, it's living in a much better, it's a much better life.
Yeah. Hmm. I have one more question for you for our dialogue, Brian, and then we're going to transition over to Q&A, and we're already getting some good questions queued up
Mhm.
here. My final question for you is, does our Christian tradition have the resources to deal with this moment?
I love that question.
The moment.
I love that question. Folks can quote me on this. Our Christian tradition has the resources to destroy us, and it has the resources to help us have a breakthrough.
Mm.
It just depends which resources we pick. The Christian tradition has such a range of staggering, ugly, harmful, distorted, life denying, horror, just, you know, blasphemous doctrine. And it has life giving, liberating insight as well. And this is a time where we have to sort through and decide which of the resources we want to take. In the Christian tradition, were the resources for white supremacy and slavery. Uh, my grandfather, one of my grandfathers, was a white supremacist and a Christian missionary.
Mm.
And I would remember being 14 years old and the day that Dr. King, the weekend that Dr. King was shot, and I heard my grandfather say racist things. I'd never heard him, I didn't know this about him. And
Mm.
I must have said something because I remember his finger pointing at me and he starts
Mhm.
quoting me all these Bible verses that were just racist
Yeah.
crap, right? Um, and but it's what he believed in. Millions of people, probably the majority of Christians of his generation, that's how they saw things. That is part of the Christian tradition. But also part of the Christian tradition is Dr. King and Desmond Tutu and all the people who have found in the faith resources to fight that very thing. The verses that have there have been verses from the Bible that have been lifted out to justify the destruction of the earth, and there are verses that can be excavated to help us save the earth. So the Christian tradition has a lot that can be used in a lot of different ways. And this is our moral responsibility. And nobody can do this thinking for us. And
Mm.
this is where I like if I could wish something on every person, you are hereby authorized to live a better version of the Christian tradition. You are hereby authorized to take those harmful parts of the Christian tradition and throw them out. Stop using them. Just get on with the better parts of this tradition. So that's what I would say.
Mm. A good word. Yeah. Thanks, Brian. Okay, we're going to shift over to questions from all of you. So please, if you have questions, put them into the Q&A function. I saw some questions come into the chat. I'm not going to see them there. So if you want us to ask those, then put them in the Q&A. Brian, the first one was from Colia. Colia says, in your introduction, you invite us to live your life. If you live your life as a book, Florida would ban it. She says, I love that. What does that look like and how do we get there? And Colette says she's sharing this book with her Earth and Spirit Mission Group, a faith community of seekers, church within the Church of the Savior,
Oh, that's great.
and that it's a refreshing and painful naming of our reality.
Well, well, that's sort of humorously said, but I mean, this is probably part of the reason why there's an extra dose of intensity in my writing because I lived in Florida for 15 years. You know, our state, uh, our governor and our legislature have actively opposed this year legislation to protect outdoor workers from
Mm.
extreme heat. I mean, can you all imagine that? It our last two governors have told state employees not to use terms like global warming, climate change. I mean, the we're a state that is super, super vulnerable, and they're acting. And as a result, what's happening is we don't have political leadership to help us take climate change seriously. We only have economic leadership. Now insurance rates are going so high, right, that it's destructive to this state. So, but listen, what Florida is to the rest of the United States, the rest of the United States is in comparison to other parts of the world. So
Mm.
we,
Mm.
and can I just say, this is why voting in a few weeks is so absolutely important. And one of the most important things we can do is urge everyone who we know will vote for more climate friendly candidates to encourage them to vote. And if there are any swingable voters that you know, to just give your testimony, you know, and say, look, I'm not telling you how to vote, but I want to tell you what really matters to me. And if it has any effect on you, fine. And if not, I understand. You know, you might not listen to what I say. But yeah, uh, uh, so I
Yeah.
hope that responds to that
Yeah. Yeah.
question.
On the, I'll just drop in here on the voting front. We're co-hosting an event with the BTS Center, our friends at the BTS Center,
Great.
a 3-hour workshop on making the connection between climate, preaching, and politics and voting in the election. Basically, how to preach prophetically so that we still have a community on the other side of the election.
Oh man, that's so needed.
Right,
That's
right.
so
So
needed.
um, I'll mention that again at the end, but while we're on the topic, I wanted to mention that and drop that information into the chat. For those of
Yeah.
you who preach, or for those of you who are just trying to figure out how do we speak prophetically and boldly and also build community, join us at that.
Mm.
Um, Brian, the next question is from Marianne. Marianne's asking about parables.
Mm.
And Marianne's asking, how have you and others used stories to help people process fear, uncertainty, and empower
Mm.
people to act?
Mm.
And are there components of those stories that will resonate across generations, places, faiths, and cultures?
Mm. Great. That's a great question. So, uh, first of all, I think uh, the question uh, has an assumption that is more important than anything I could say, and that is this is a good time to tell stories.
Hmm.
Um, and but let me say, I'm going to contradict myself. I want to say two opposite things to start off, and then I'll say something a little more productive. Like, I think we need to tell stories of progress and breakthroughs because the fact is there is so much progress and there are so many breakthroughs. So I think those stories are good to tell because they help people realize, wow, let me just give you an example. Uh, back if we were to go back to the early 2000s, our acceleration of the burning of fossil fuels was leading us to something like 6 or 7 degrees centigrade of climate change by the end of the century. And we've already brought that down from 7 to 6 to 5. You know, the, we're somewhere between 2 and 5 right now, and that's 5 is horrible, right? So we're not there, but we've bent the curve a little bit already. We need to tell those stories of making progress. I mean, amazing progress. I mean, just the existence of solar panels, and people get mad at China. China is making huge numbers of solar panels, and people get mad at them because for economic reasons. But man, I'm glad they're making this. I'm glad somebody's making those solar panels, and they're making cheap electric vehicles. And the scientific community's had incredible breakthroughs with battery technology, all these things. We should tell all those stories. But I also want to say there's a way that telling stories, positive stories, then allows people to slip into complacency.
Right.
Oh, the problem solved. Like
Yeah.
we suck up those stories.
Mhm.
So here's what I recommend. Any stories we can tell about resilient people who
Yep.
fought on the right side and lost and lost and lost and lost and lost. And sometimes it was their children or grandchildren who won, but they kept fighting because it was the right thing. The early abolitionists, to think of the courage of the early Quakers in the United States who spoke up against slavery. Um, the struggle for in this country for women to get the right to vote. I mean, it's staggering. It's an inspiring story. Go to see those movies and watch those documentaries. I mean, those are phenomenal stories. The story for LGBT equality is just a breathtaking story of creativity and persistence and heartbreak because of how long it took, right? Uh, and, but those kinds of stories. I went back and reread the story of Ernest Shackleton and the voyage to the South Pole. That was a
Mhm.
failed voyage, but they got back. They survived catastrophe after catastrophe, and so I think those kinds of stories are inspiring and good and healthy stories.
Mhm.
Let me just also say, this could be a fascinating time to try to create our own short parables. You know,
Wow.
like
Mhm.
you remember how Jesus said, "What shall it profit if you gain the whole world and lose your soul?" We need to come up with little sayings like, "I'm not sure what good it means to have 4% economic growth if your growth is accelerating the destruction of your planet, just so I think there are things that we can do. Sometimes I think the best way we honor Jesus is not just by repeating what he said, but by repeating the his instincts and by living on his skill set in some way.
I suspect that this is where your love of sci-fi comes from as well.
Yeah.
The way that sci-fi can kind of break us out of the dominant narratives. When you're talking about that paradox of
Yeah,
positive stories, but also human stories,
yeah,
um, I think of Ministry for the Future.
yes,
The came out this Cli-Fi book that came out just a few years ago just does it so beautifully, mixes
yes,
together. Yes, technology is a part of the solution, but really the solution comes in the people.
yeah, yes,
Technology is part of the picture, but it's about the people.
yes,
Um, Another really good question coming in from Keith. So Keith asks, your emphasis on facing a difficult and really scary reality made me think that the early church grew and flourished in a very difficult and
yeah,
dangerous time for the church. So what do you think about the early church providing a model for surviving doom?
yes. Oh my goodness, this is such a great question. Such a great question. Let me give folks a little, let me give you a little maxim that has helped me since I was probably in my 20s. And here it is. Yesterday's problems lead to today's solutions, and today's solutions lead to tomorrow's problems. um, you know, I mean, we go through these cycles, right? Kind of like that infinity loop. The solution creates a problem that creates another solution that creates another problem. So if you talk about the historical situation of uh, that we begin with in the Gospels and in the time of the Acts of the Apostles, you have Jewish people who are being oppressed by the Romans, and some of them are capitulating and losing their identity and just being tempted to make a buck with the Romans. I know it's hard for people to imagine people losing their spirituality because they just want to make money, but that was a big problem back then. And uh, and then others say, no, we shouldn't do that. And they're ready to have a violent revolution, to take up arms and storm the temple. Whoops, does that sound familiar? For their political cause. And Jesus comes along and basically says, those are two really bad solutions. And he tries to propose a different way of living in this very difficult situation. And this movement starts. And to everyone's surprise, 300 years later, the Roman emperor claims that he is now on the side of Christianity. I think it's a mistake to ever speak of the conversion of Constantine. I think it's much more
Hmm.
accurate to talk about Constantine's conversion of Christianity, but that's another whole story.
Yeah.
But now there is a new problem. And the new problem is this Roman Empire now has taken the cross and made it its own logo of violent domination. It has 100% inverted the original meaning of the cross. And so what happens now? Many Christians say, we don't want to be part of this. We're going to go establish a little alternative community out in the Egyptian desert. And we're going to try to remember what this thing is supposed to really be about because we're watching it be corrupted, uh, across the empire. And and later, people like Benedict start and they spread these little groups around. And later, Patrick and then the Celts and then St. Francis comes along. So there are all these different movements to keep trying to rediscover what this thing was about at the beginning because we keep losing our point. So um, now I have totally forgotten what your question was, but somehow that
Well, it was
disappeared.
about the early church surviving doom,
Yes.
really. And I mean, what I'm hearing is all along the way, it's stories of people trying to be faithful and understand what looks like the ending, or maybe is the ending of their world, right?
And in fact, that's what's so great. Thanks for bringing us back to the question. And the question is great because it reminds us that worlds, meaning civilizations, are always coming and going.
Yeah.
And it really provides a lens into the entire Bible to say people are trying to find a way of life that isn't limited to this civilization and its values and structures and prejudices and skills and glories, right? That there's a way of life that's bigger. And in fact, you can try this on for size, but the phrase uh, eternal life that especially we find in the Gospel of John and Paul uses it some. Um, uh, this phrase eternal life in Greek is zoan aeonian, life of the ages, life of the eons. And
mm,
there's a place in the New Testament where Paul speaks of this present age. And I wonder, I think this is a window into maybe what's going on some deeper level in the Bible, that there's life in this empire, and then there's life of the ages, the bigger arc of life that isn't defined by this human regime. And that is a pretty good description, I think, of what all of us are in the process of imagining. If this present regime, based on fossil fuels, based on horrible, violent weapons, if this whole regime based on a rich elite that has an excess of luxuries and growing percentages of masses who are left struggling for necessities, if this whole regime is reaching its end life, how do we extract ourselves and our hopes from it and put our energy into the life of the ages that isn't limited to how this regime works?
mm, mm, mm. We have a question too, Brian, coming in from Peter. Peter asks, Sarah Augustine, or Sarah Augustine, I think is how you pronounce her last name, Indigenous author and activist, talks about lowercase reality and uppercase capital R reality. Dominant culture reality in our post-industrial context depends on perpetual growth in a market economy, but within the creation that we depend on, the capital R reality
Yeah,
dictates that all life is mutually dependent in a
yeah,
finite world.
yeah.
He says, I wonder if our spiritual journeys are about learning to see and understand capital R reality
Yes.
and to move towards it, towards life, and away from lowercase r reality,
Oh,
which seems to be leading everything towards death.
oh, thanks. I love that. I love that. Sacred reality and
Hmm.
desecrated reality. So the capitalization is a way of saying there's a
Yeah.
sacred reality. And as the way Avery, you have framed these three gatherings of life of uh, resurrection and death and this Paschal cycle, right? There's a sacred reality that has a certain balance of life and death and winter, spring, summer, fall, has these balances built in toward it, that a tree grows and accumulates in its trunk huge reserves of wealth, and then it dies, and the wealth is given back to the soil, and the new plants can and organisms can grow. This, and instead of seeing that as a horrible, tragic cycle, to see it as that's the sacred cycle. And our little realities of regimes of oppression and domination and exploitation and all the rest
Hmm.
are just a little bubble that we try to create that's really a desecration of this other sacred reality. Oh, I love that.
Hmm.
Thanks to the person who sent that.
Yeah. Brian, we are going to need to transition here to our closing in just a moment, but I want to give you a final word here before I share some closing remarks. Anything that we haven't touched on yet that you want to say?
Well, I first thank you to you and thanks to all the people. Thanks for these great questions. Thanks, Avery, for your questions. I'm honored to be with you. We're all in this together. I think something is trying to be born in all of us. And I only know this secondhand from being present at the birth of my four children. But when things get born, it's messy and it's painful, but it's worth it. So uh,
Hmm.
we're all in this giving birth process together.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. I'm going to spring this upon you, but after I go through closing remarks, I'm going to ask if you'll send us with a benediction.
Be happy to.
So, while I'm going through this, you can think about how you want to send us from this space.
Great.
Um, Thanks everyone for being here. I want to close out with just a few upcoming opportunities that are related to what we're talking about here. The first is I mentioned our friends at the BTS Center. They're hosting a book study on Life After Doom starting in October. So for 5 Tuesdays starting in October. So if you want to engage with the good folks at the BTS Center, study the book with a community of friends, And then at the end of that, I know that they're doing an evening session with you, Brian. And so another chance to hang out with Brian in the evening. I just want to highlight again what I mentioned earlier, which is the Politics in the Pulpit event, which is coming up on October 3rd. I saw someone ask if laity can come to this. Yes, this is open to anyone. So if it would be beneficial to you, whether or not you preach, you are welcome to join us there. And then if you haven't yet purchased a copy of Life After Doom, I'm sure by this point you're convinced that you should do so. I'll drop in a link to Creation Justice Ministries bookshop.org, a bookstore front. So if you purchase it through here, we'll receive 10% of the purchase price. And also bookshop.org supports local bookstores. So if you're choosing between this and Amazon or any of the big box stores, choose either bookshop.org or of course, buy it at your local social justice oriented bookstore. Um, Finally, we want to hear from you all how this event was for you. So we're going to ask you to, if you'll just take a couple minutes after you log off here to take an evaluation survey to give us some feedback on how the event was tonight. You can do so using that form there, and we'll also include that in the follow-up email. With that, Brian, I'm going to hand it over
Mm.
to you to send us forth.
Well, this is a variation on actually a table grace that has been meaningful to me in recent years. And if you would like to, you could just kind of put your hand over your heart, take a deep breath. And if you're in a place where you can do this, you can do it aloud. And if not, you can just do it silently. But I'll invite you to repeat after me. For this breath,
For this breath,
for this heartbeat,
this heartbeat,
for this conversation with these companions,
for this conversation with these companions,
for the web of life of which we're part.
the web of life, which we're part.
We give thanks with all our heart.
We give thanks with all our heart.
Amen.
Amen. Mm. Thank you, Brian, with all my heart. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
thanks to everyone for joining us here tonight. Have a blessed evening.
Blessings, everyone.